Rain had fallen on the mountains for half an hour before she reached the Cedar Gate. That forgotten road into Iron Creek ended here. Her bare feet pressed into cold gray mud. The canvas satchel on her shoulder hung swollen with water, her clothes pasted to a body carved thin by exhaustion, the kind that lives in the marrow. A stranger leaned against the damp fencewood, watching her with the silent, measuring eyes of a man shaved by isolation. She did not cry. She offered no rehearsed explanation, no long story stitched together for sympathy. People who have spent entire lives needing too much eventually arrive at a place where words simply stop coming. She held his gaze with dark, hollow eyes, wet her lips, cracked by the relentless Montana sun and the thirst nothing could touch. Then spoke the only sentence she had left. "Let me sleep in the barn. I'll work for my keep." He didn't answer right away. Stood there, still as the fence post beside him, reading her with that unhurried quiet you find in men who live where the ridgeline meets the sky. No cruelty in his look, no kindness either, just observation. Mina allowed it. She had nothing left to guard. The mountain rain that started 30 minutes back along that Iron Creek dust road had soaked her through to the skin. The canvas satchel had drunk its fill, doubling in weight. Mud clung thick to her bare feet. Somewhere deep inside her, unspoken, unacknowledged, something was growing. She didn't understand it yet, but lately her weariness had taken on a heaviness that sleep alone could never explain. Wind drove a dry pine needle between them. The sky bruised over to a deep, angry purple. The man studied the clouds massing with purpose, glanced back at the solid barn behind his house. Looked at her one last time. "You can stay," he said. Voice like gravel, short, spare. The voice of a man who rarely used it. Fresh straw in the back of the barn. Lantern on the center beam. When the real storm hits, that roof holds. You'll stay dry. Mina gave a nod so small it barely existed. No smile. No wasted breath on thanks. She pushed through the gate and crossed the yard toward the barn. Feet sinking into cold mud, that heavy bundle dragging at her like grief. She never looked back to check if he was watching. Arthur stood at the gate, her shape shrinking through the rain, and the thought rose unbidden. When had anyone last truly crossed that threshold into his world? The rain answered before memory could, crashing down in a sudden wall of water that hammered the barn's tin roof and churned the yard to soup. He retreated inside his own house, but he lingered a beat too long before throwing the bolt. Arthur Miller was 43. He had lived alone on this ranch for close to 3 years. He was not a man who complained, never had been. He'd grown up in a house where men did not weep, did not ask for help, and never once let weakness show. That lesson had burrowed so deep, he eventually lost the ability to tell real strength from numbness. Claire had died on a bitter March morning during a birth that should never have gone so wrong. The baby came far too early. An unseasonable thaw had turned the mountain road to mud and ruin. The drive to the nearest hospital took twice as long as it should have. He'd gripped that wheel until his knuckles went white, jaw locked shut, talking to her the whole way, telling her it would be all right, begging her to keep breathing, telling her they were close. She made it to the hospital alive, still conscious, but she never came back out. The child didn't either. Arthur drove that flooded road home alone, dead of night. The truck still held her perfume, threaded through with the clean, sterile bite of the hospital. A silence settled into his chest on that drive. It never left. The ranch died with him after that. Slow, quiet, no ceremony to it. Weeds swallowed the vegetable garden. He sold off the livestock and the corrals went mute. Fences sagged where they pleased. He let it all go. The wood stove only got lit when hunger chewed at him hard enough to demand attention. Chickens wandered free. Nobody gathered them anymore. The house wasn't filthy. It was hollow. The kind of emptiness no visitor could see, but it pressed into every corner like something physical. Sunlight didn't help. Sunlight through those windows only reminded him who should have been standing in it. The closest neighbors lived 4 kilometers out. Town sat nearly 15 away. Weeks passed without a single figure on the road below, and somewhere along the way he stopped noticing the solitude. Yet tonight, a mud-caked stranger slept across the yard. He had learned to carry that silence the way a man learns to live with a wound that won't heal. Not because the pain fades, because the body simply stops fighting it. Arthur woke to the smell of coffee. He stayed flat on his back, eyes pressed shut. His nose caught it long before his mind believed it. Rich, dark, brewed slow and proper, the kind that fills a house room by room and reaches the bedroom before anything else does. He hadn't made morning coffee in months. Most days he drank cold water standing in the kitchen. Sometimes chewed a strip of dried jerky if he remembered food existed. But coffee like this, steeped and heavy and real, that smell had left his home alongside everything else worth having. He opened his eyes. Dark timber ceiling above him. Light crept through the shutter gaps, that pale, uncommitted gray before the sun decides to show. The day hadn't made up its mind yet. He swung his legs off the bed and pulled on his boots standing, a reflex carved by decades of wrench work. Then he walked toward the kitchen. She stood with her back to him. One hand worked the wood stove. The other gripped the handle of an old pot he'd forgotten still existed. She'd started the fire with wood from the outside pile, wood still damp from last night's rain. Getting a flame from that would have taken patience and stubbornness both. It hadn't been easy, but there it burned, a steady orange glow playing across the old plank walls. The kitchen table looked different too. A folded cloth sat at its center. A rag he used for other things entirely, but she'd washed it, wrung it dry, and laid it flat like it belonged there, like it had always been a tablecloth. On top of it sat a mug of coffee and a piece of cornbread, made from cornmeal that had been buried in the back of his pantry for longer than he cared to admit. Arthur stopped in the doorway. She felt him there, turned without surprise, without a smile, just that same steady level gaze from the night before. "Good morning," she said. Voice low and even. "I found the cornmeal in the sack at the back. Made some bread. I hope you don't mind." He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved across the kitchen, the table, then her. He said. He pulled out a chair and sat. Both hands wrapped the mug, thick fingers, split-knuckled, ground dark with decades of soil. He drank that first swallow slow, eyes on the table. The coffee was strong, bitter the honest way, the way only a wood stove brew can be. He said nothing more, drank it to the last drop. Her name was Mina. He learned this because she offered it freely, unprompted, while washing the mug in the basin after breakfast. She said. He nodded, asked nothing further. She gave nothing further. That was how their exchanges ran in those early days. Short, clean statements stripped bare of decoration. Not from coldness, from experience. Both had learned, each in their own hard way, that too many words tangle what should be simple. The silence between them carried no weight. It was just space. The kind of space that settles between people who feel no need to pretend they have more to say than they do. After breakfast, Mina went outside. Arthur lingered in the kitchen a moment, listening. He heard the scratch of an old broom across packed dirt. Chickens clucking as they shuffled out of its path. The sharp rhythmic crack of a rug being beaten clean. He stood and looked through the window. She was sweeping the yard with that broom that had leaned against the barn wall, so long mold had crawled up its handle. She swept in steady, unhurried strokes, gathering pine needles shaken loose by last night's storm, stray feathers, clods of mud now cracking dry under the young sun. No rush to her, no pause either. A quiet, even rhythm. The posture of someone who learned early that if you don't do the work, nobody will. Arthur watched her longer than he meant to. Then he grabbed his hat and went out the back door to see to his own tasks. That morning, for the first time in longer than he could recall, two people worked the same ground without getting in each other's way. She kept to the yard and the chicken coop. He was out in the pasture, fixing a loose board on the corral he'd sworn he would mend months ago. The sun climbed higher. It burned off what the rain had left behind, and the smell of wet earth drying began to rise through the air. That scent, anyone raised in country like this carries it somewhere inside them forever. Warm, alive, thick with the promise of something new. Around midday, Arthur passed the chicken coop and stopped. Mina was crouched in the corner, gathering eggs the hens had scattered across the dirt floor. But it wasn't the eggs that held him. It was the way she crouched, too slowly, one hand pressed hard against her knee, like she needed the brace. When she straightened, a shadow of dizziness swept her face. Just a flicker, gone before it could settle. She buried it fast. "Lunch is almost ready," she said, not looking at him, as though nothing had happened. Arthur nodded, said nothing, but he kept his eye on her after that. Lunch was rice and some old beans she'd found buried in the pantry, seasoned with what she could gather: garlic, salt, a dried bay leaf that had hung from a nail on the wall for God knows how long. Alongside it, scrambled eggs folded through with green onions growing wild in the neglected garden bed by the window. A simple meal, warm, made with a care that was quiet but unmistakable. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table and ate without speaking. Just the wind threading through the window frame and the far-off murmur of the creek down at the bottom of the ravine. A sound Arthur had stopped hearing long ago. How long, he couldn't say, but now it reached him, clear, unmistakable. Halfway through the meal, Mina stopped eating. She stared at her plate. Then her hand moved across her abdomen. That same motion as before, quick, nearly invisible. Arthur was watching when it happened. Her eyes lifted and found his. Neither of them spoke. Then she looked down and picked up her fork again. So did he. But something in the room had shifted. An unspoken truth had settled between the two plates of beans. Heavy, impossible to ignore. That afternoon, pulling weeds from the pasture, Arthur couldn't shake it from his mind. He wasn't the kind of man who inserted himself into other people's business. The mountains teach you that much. Every person carries their own weight. If they want to set it down in front of you, they will. You don't ask. You don't dig. You wait. But her exhaustion, he couldn't look past it. This wasn't trail weariness. It wasn't fever picked up on the road. It ran deeper than that, rooted in the body itself. And that gesture, the hand pressed flat against her belly, was something the flesh does before the mind catches up. He knew that gesture. He'd seen it in Claire. The recognition hit him like a fist to the sternum, then passed just as fast. What remained was the old ache in his chest. Not sharp anymore, blunt, permanent. The kind that never fully leaves. He drove his hoe into the dirt and stood there, leaning on the handle, staring down at the creek below. The water moved the way it always had. The sun dropped lower, flooding the sky with that ancient gold only high country reveals in late afternoon. When had he last stopped to notice it? Back at the house, dinner was already on the table. Chicken soup, made from the lame hen that had been hobbling around the yard for weeks. The one he'd lacked the will to catch. Catching it meant deciding. Deciding meant effort he didn't have. She had caught it, dressed it, cooked it with rice and herbs. The smell filling that kitchen wasn't just a smell. It was memory. It was childhood. A comfort you don't know you've been starving for until it finds you again. Arthur sat down. He looked at the bowl a long moment before picking up his spoon. "You didn't have to kill the hen," he said. "Not a complaint." An observation. "She was suffering," Mina answered from the stove, her back still turned. "A twisted leg makes every day a punishment. This was mercy." He didn't argue. He ate. The silence that surrounded them that evening had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had begun, slowly, without rushing, to lower their guard. Tuesday, 3 days since her arrival. Mina had risen before dawn, same as always. Lit the stove, brewed the coffee, swept the yard, fed the chickens, washed the linens that had been soaking overnight. All of it finished before Arthur swung his boots off the bed. That was how she operated. Her body woke and went straight to work. No pause, no gathering of thoughts. It had been that way since she was a girl. Either her mother called her before sunrise, or life did. And in recent years, it had always been life, which has no patience and no sense of timing. Around 10 in the morning, the sun sat directly overhead. Heat pressed down on the yard like a hand, heavy and still. Mina gathered a bucket and a bundle of laundry and started down the ravine toward the creek. The slope dropped steeply, bordered on both sides by tall grass along a narrow trail someone, Arthur most likely, had cut through the brush years before. Tree roots crossed the reddish earth like gnarled fingers. She went down slow and deliberate, bucket in one hand, fingers catching at scrub branches with the other. The air shifted as she dropped lower, cooler, thicker with moisture, carrying the smell of water and deep shade. The creek moved easy over rounded stones, neither wide nor deep. Quiet water that knew where it was headed, but felt no rush getting there. The near bank was a broad, flat slab of rock, worn smooth by years and darkened with damp, a natural washboard. Across the way, thick timber leaned out over the current, and sunlight came through the canopy in thin gold threads that trembled on the surface. Mina set the bucket down, stood still, just looked. It had been a long time since she'd stopped long enough to see anything at all. The months behind her had been nothing but movement. Leaving one place because there was no room, searching for another, turned away, moving again. She'd carried her bundle from town to town, like the weight of it might somehow ease that other burden she held inside, the one with no handles, no bottom, no way to set it down. But here, with the creek talking low and the wet earth breathing its dark scent, her body found a moment's stillness. She started on the laundry, slow, deliberate strokes. Soap, stone, ring, into the bucket. The rhythm of it, the steady sound of water, something close to peace settled over her. The kind of work that looks simple but carries a quiet grace. Hands busy, mind finally allowed to go still. She washed her own clothes, the kitchen rags, the old tablecloth. Then, without thinking much about it, she pulled Arthur's 2 shirts from near the basin and scrubbed those too. Not a decision, just what a person does when sharing a space. You tend to what's near you because it needs tending. Living alongside another soul, even a stranger, builds an unspoken duty that wants no contract. That's when the dizziness hit. It came on slow. First a strange warmth at the base of her skull. Then a faint sickness rising from her gut. The world going sideways beneath her. She had to stop. Eyes shut, palm pressed flat against cold stone to keep from going down. She stayed that way a long while, breathing in the sound of the creek, feeling the sun warm across her back. The spell passed, but when she opened her eyes and tried to straighten, her legs had turned to water. This wasn't the weakness that comes from labor. It rose from somewhere deeper. The kind of signal a body sends when it's trying to tell the mind something the mind isn't ready to hear. She stood at the rock's edge, watching the current, and slowly, with terrible care, laid her hand across her belly. She held there a long time, The creek kept moving, the birds kept singing, and something inside her, a knowing that had been building for days, maybe weeks, went solid as stone. She closed her eyes. The tears came silent. No sobs, no display. They ran down her face the way rain slides off rock. She couldn't say whether she wept from fear, from shock, from loneliness, or from that strange relief that comes when you finally stop running from the truth. Arthur saw her from the top of the ravine. He'd gone up to fetch a hoe he'd left near the trail. Through the brush, at a distance, he caught her outline against the bright water. Shoulders slightly bowed, one hand resting on her belly, her body rising and falling with soundless grief. He did not go down to her. He knew, the way only years of living can teach a man, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is stay away. But he didn't leave. He stood among the trees like a sentinel she never asked for, watching her, small against that white slab of rock in the thick woods. He studied the slope of her shoulders, the hand pressed to her belly, wet hair hanging across her face. Something shifted behind his ribs. Not want, not quite pity either. Recognition. That bone-deep knowing when you see pain in another person that matches your own. It skips past names and pleasantries, cuts straight to the marrow. He stayed until she stood, collected her pail, and began climbing back up. Then he slipped toward the pasture before she crested the ridge. All that afternoon, mending fence wire, Arthur thought about her. Not intrusively, protectively. At supper she was quieter than usual, and that meant something. They ate to the thin music of forks on tin and wind pressing against the walls. A single lantern sat between them on the table, throwing unsteady gold across their faces. Shadows swayed on the timber behind them. Halfway through the meal, Arthur set his fork down. She looked up. He held still a moment, turning words over before speaking them. He wasn't trying to sound clever. He was trying not to get it wrong. "There's a woman in town," he said at last. "Nora. She's a midwife. Knows about women's matters. If you want to see her sometime, I'll take you." Mina watched him, lamplight trembling in the space between. She didn't say yes, didn't say no. She gave him that long, steady look he'd grown to respect. Not defiance, but calculation. Measuring whether something lurked beneath his words. She found nothing hidden there. Quote, 1, 4, she said quietly. Arthur nodded once, retrieved his fork, and went back to eating. The silence that returned to the table had changed. Honesty lived in it now. Some small, fragile truth had been set down between them. Like a young bird tumbled from its nest, unsure whether its wings could hold. That night, lying in the barn with the creek murmuring beyond the walls, Mina thought, quote 15, quote, "It wasn't praise, it was admission. That something real existed here. In the smell of the earth, the rhythm of rain on the tin roof, the stillness of a man who neither pried nor turned away." After everything she'd survived, the absence of threat was no small thing. It was enough. The town sat 15 kilometers off, down a winding dirt road. Arthur brought her out early, before the mountain heat could build its full weight. He rode the old buckskin, the only horse left on the ranch. Tired animal, but dependable. It knew every bend in that trail by memory. Mina sat behind him, her bundle balanced on her lap, gripping with her knees. She did not lean into his back. She hadn't leaned on anyone in a long time. The ride was rough and real. Red dirt cutting through thick stands of pine, the sky above pale as fresh milk. Arthur kept the horse at an easy walk. The animal remembered the way, had carried another rider down this same path. Arthur let that thought pass through him without holding it, like a cloud drifting. They rode most of the distance without a word. Near the edge of the small settlement, Mina spoke low. "You don't have to wait. If you've got business, I can find my way." He said, "I'll wait." Nora's place stood at the far end of what passed for a main street, a crooked line of weathered buildings. A small house, painted a blue that had long since faded, with a broad patch of sagebrush out front that threw its sharp scent whenever the wind moved through. Inside, the air carried lavender, beeswax, and that nameless smell old houses hold in their walls. Nora was past 70, her face mapped by decades of mountain winters. Her eyes bright with a knowing that missed nothing. Small woman, white hair pinned loose at the back of her skull, denim apron she wore like skin, never without it. Her hands were too large for her body, hands that had kneaded bread, pulled herbs from dirt, and caught newborns before they hit the world. When Mina stepped inside, Nora was seated by the window, stitching a quilt with the slow, deliberate patience of someone who had stopped counting hours long ago. She glanced up. Her eyes found Mina. 2 seconds was all she needed. Mina sat, and without being asked, the words rose out of her. Clumsy at first, catching in her throat, breaking apart where the pain thickened. But they came. She told Nora about her mother's death, about Nathan casting her out with a handful of belongings and 2 days to vanish, about the shelters she drifted through and couldn't hold, about a weariness that had settled into her bones and refused to leave. Nora did not interrupt. When Mina finished, the old woman stood, disappeared into the next room, and came back carrying a small glass vial of dried herbs. She pressed her palms to Mina's temples, held them there, eyes shut, lips murmuring something silent and old. __, quote _ 19 __. Nora said quietly. Mina did not move. Her eyes stayed dry. The creek had already claimed whatever tears she had left. Quote 20, quote, she asked. Quote 21, quote. Nora answered, settling back into her chair. Quote 22, quote. Mina looked toward the window. A stray dog lay sleeping beneath a pine tree's shadow. Midday light struck the blue walls of the house and made them glow. And the father? Nora's voice carried no accusation, only weight. Mina drew one breath before answering. Quote 24, quote, she said. Nora dipped her chin. Quote 25, quote. Mina thought of the ranch, the wood stove, the creek, the man standing outside with the horse. Quote 26 she said. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she believed her own words. Arthur leaned against the fence rail, reins loose in one hand, eyes tracking the quiet lane. When she came through the door, he asked nothing. He just watched. What he read in her face was not the despair he'd braced for, something else, heavier than joy, lighter than grief. He understood without a syllable passing between them. He readied the horse. As she moved to mount, he held out his hand, open, steady, unhurried. She looked at it, then laid her palm across his and swung into the saddle. He said nothing about the gesture. Halfway back to the ranch, she spoke. "I'm having a baby." His hand on the reins did not tighten. His body did not stiffen. "I know," he said. That stopped her. "How long have you known?" "Since the first day," he told her. Mina turned her face toward the tree sliding past and offered nothing more. But something knotted deep in her chest loosened, just barely. That afternoon, Arthur walked into his pantry and counted every jar, every sack, every tin on the shelves. He told her none of this, he simply did it. Tallied it all in his head, then stepped outside to check the hens and the garden plot. He stood a long while before that overgrown patch of earth. Then he picked up a hoe and started clearing it. Mina watched from the kitchen window, a potato half peeled in her hand. She watched the man bent over the soil in fading daylight, shirt dark with sweat, battered hat tilted wrong on his head. She knew what he was doing, not gardening, preparing to feed more than himself. She turned back to the potatoes, her vision blurred, not from sorrow, but from something she had never properly learned to accept. the feeling of being provided for, of mattering to someone's plans. The days found a rhythm after that. Neither of them named it, neither of them planned it. It grew on its own, the way a trail through timber hardens into a real path when enough boots cross the same ground. Mornings, she rose first and lit the stove. He'd catch the smell of coffee, pull on his boots, and appear in the kitchen doorway. They ate together in an easy silence, trading small words now and then. The weather, what needed doing before dark. After breakfast, he worked the pastures and tended the stock. She stayed close to the house. By mid-morning, their orbits would cross. He needed a tool from the shed. She was crouched over the garden rows. These meetings lost their awkwardness by degrees, something settling into place, quiet as dust on a windowsill. At noon, she cooked whatever the pantry offered, and he ate like a man, remembering what hunger felt like. She learned to read him without words. The way his hand drifted toward a second helping without asking. The way he sat a bit longer at the table before pushing back his chair and heading outside. He taught her things too. Not lessons, not instructions. The way a person absorbs knowledge when they are paying attention with more than their ears. One morning, sky the color of old iron, wind swinging north, Arthur stopped in the yard. He stood there, studying the horizon like it owed him something. He said. Mina paused, pail in hand. He didn't look at her. Carrying rain smell of the mountains. Creek'll be up by mid-afternoon. Won't take the house, but that washing stone will be gone. She searched the sky, trying to see what he saw. How can you tell? He thought on it a moment. Creek talks to you, he said, but it speaks its own language. Takes time to learn. He walked off toward his work. She stayed there, feeling the wind press against her face, trying to hear what he heard in it. That afternoon, the creek swelled dark and angry, and the washing stone vanished beneath the current. Mina's pregnancy moved forward in its own slow time. At first, only she knew. A careful eye might have caught the signs. Soon enough, no eye would miss them. The changes brought a weariness that sat deep in her bones. Mornings turned sour with nausea that kept her gray-faced and hollow past 9. She never spoke a word of complaint. She adapted, smaller pale, sitting when she could, waiting out the sickness before starting her work. Arthur noticed. He noticed the way a man does who spent decades reading weather and livestock and land, by watching, not asking. He shifted his own rhythm to match hers. No announcement, no conversation about it. The water bucket sat full each morning before she reached the kitchen. Firewood appeared stacked beside the stove, split and dry. One morning, a broom leaned against the barn door. Shorter handle, lighter weight. She stared at it for a long time. Then she stepped inside the barn, pressed her back against the wall in the cool dimness, and breathed slow and deliberate until the tightness in her chest loosened. The big storm hit on a Wednesday night. Not some passing afternoon squall, a true mountain storm, the kind that means business. It broke loose at midnight and kept hammering. Rain beating the tin roof so hard it swallowed every other sound in the world. Arthur woke, knowing the creek would be wild. The house sat on high ground, safe enough. The barn did not. He pulled on his boots, grabbed the lantern, and ran through rain that hit like cold gravel. He pounded on the barn door. Mina, open up! She was there fast, eyes sharp, body tense. Creek's about to come over its banks, he called through the downpour. You can't stay out here tonight. Come to the house. She hesitated. I don't want to be trouble. You're not. His voice left no room for argument. There's a spare room. Take it. The spare room had been Claire's. After she died, it became a place where memory collected like sediment. Then just an empty room. Bed made tight, waiting for someone who would never return. Arthur lifted the lantern so Mina could see. A quilt covered the bed, sewn from scraps of bright cloth. Claire's hands had stitched it during some long ago winter. Mina looked at the quilt. Sleep here, he said. I'm right next door if you need something. He stepped out and pulled the door closed, quiet as a man handling something fragile. On the other side, she lowered herself to the edge of the mattress, listened to the rain. Inside the house, it sounded different, softer, farther away, safe. She lay back, pulled the quilt to her chin, and slept, deeper than she had in months. No part of her braced for footsteps or a turning handle. No part of her kept watch. They slept under one roof, a thin wall of pine boards between them, closer than they had ever been. It was a Friday in August when the quiet inside that house changed its nature. Mina had been still all day. Not the restful kind of still, the kind that gathers weight, like storm clouds banking low over a ridge. Arthur noticed she'd barely touched her coffee. Noticed the way she stood at the window, palm pressed flat against her belly, staring at nothing. He didn't ask. But he stayed close, finding work within earshot of the door. Come afternoon, she went to her room early, said her back ached. By midnight, a sound reached him, low, bitten down, swallowed halfway through. He crossed the hall in 3 strides. "Mina, can I come in?" She sat on the bed's edge, face drained pale in the lantern glow. She said through clenched teeth. Arthur didn't waste a second. He knew exactly how far town was, knew every rut and washout on that road. "Can you walk?" "I think so." "Get your coat, I'll bring the horse around. You're not having this baby here alone." The ride through those mountains was a journey through pure black. Nothing but starlight overhead and the sound of hooves on packed earth. Arthur sat behind her, arms reaching past to grip the reins, his body a brace around hers. Every contraction locked her rigid against him. She never cried out, not once. He counted the gaps between them. They were shrinking. He pushed the horse harder. When they reached Faith's place, the midwife already stood in her doorway. One look at Mina told her everything. She pulled the girl inside without a word. Faith said, jabbing a finger at Arthur. So he sat on the porch steps, set his hat in his lap, watched the stars wheel overhead for 2.5 hours. Muffled sounds bled through the walls, sounds that filled his chest with dread and the hope so fragile he couldn't bring himself to name it. Then it came, a sharp, thin wail cutting clean through the night. The unmistakable first cry of a life beginning. Arthur shut his eyes, let out a breath that felt 3 years old. Faith stepped through the door, drying her hands on a rag. "Boy," she said smiling, "strong and healthy. She's doing fine." Arthur stood. His legs weren't steady beneath him. Mina lay on the narrow bed, hair dark with sweat, but her eyes held a light he'd never seen there before. Bundled in white cloth against her chest, a small, wrinkled creature, impossibly new. Arthur stepped closer. "He's all right," she whispered. "I heard him," Arthur said. He studied the infant. Tiny fists clenched tight, already gripping at the wold. "You picked a name?" "Jack," she said, "after my father." Arthur dipped his chin. "Jack, that's a good name." He stood in that cramped, warm room, and something shifted behind his ribs. Something heavy moving aside to make room for a feeling he'd written off as dead. They left for the ranch at first light. The sky hung pale violet over the ridgeline. Birds had just started up. Mina held Jack against her chest as she rode. Arthur walked beside the horse, one hand on the bridle, guiding them home. When they passed through the gate, he glanced at her and the child. Remembered her coming through that same gate barely a month before. A stranger then, carrying nothing. Now she was the center of everything under his roof. Jack grew fast, the way babies do. That wrinkled newborn filled out into a solid little body, his presence spreading through every room in the house. He learned Arthur's voice early, broke into a wide, gammy smile, the moment the man walked through a door. Arthur changed without realizing it, stopped letting doors bang shut, walked softer on the floorboards, found himself checking on the boy between every chore, stealing moments he couldn't explain. One morning, Mina sat nursing Jack at the table. She looked up at Arthur. Arthur settled into the chair. She eased the baby across, transferring that small weight into his arms. Arthur held him like he'd done it 1,000 times. Steady, sure. Jack's eyes opened. Dark, deep. Studying the man above him with an intensity no infant should possess. Then a tiny hand reached out. 5 small fingers found Arthur's thumb and locked around it, held on with a grip that defied his size. Arthur stared at that hand, said nothing. But Mina saw it. Something in his face letting go. No tears, just the slow unclenching of a man who had been stoned for longer than he could remember. She stared through the glass and let the quiet hold them both. The past arrived uninvited on a Wednesday night. Arthur's dog broke into that particular bark, the one reserved for strangers. Nathan stood at the gate, Mina's stepfather. A younger man flanked him. Nathan looked older now, worn down by years, wearing authority like a borrowed coat. "Mina," he called, "we need to talk." Arthur stepped between them and the house, lantern raised high. "Who are you?" "Family," Nathan said. "House where she grew up is in probate. She signs a few papers, we settle it clean. Might even be some money in it for her." Mina appeared in the doorway with Jack against her chest. She saw the man who had thrown her out, and something cold locked into place behind her eyes. "I have nothing to sign." Nathan started to push. Arthur's voice cut him short, hard as bedrock. __quote _70 __. Nathan measured the situation, found nothing in his favor. He backed into the dark. Arthur watched until the night swallowed them both, then turned. Mina stood on the porch. Lantern glow caught her there, caught everything they'd built in just a handful of months. He crossed the yard, killed the flame, and stood beside her. She didn't go inside. She stayed. Then, for the first time, she leaned her head against his shoulder. A careful thing, barely weighted. His shoulder didn't move. He held steady. They stood that way beneath the mountain stars. The man, the woman, the child. Below them, the creek murmured its old, indifferent song, water pushing forward no matter what stood in its path. Years began to gather after that, slow and patient, like growth rings thickening inside the ancient pines around the ranch. The recklessness of youth and the raw bite of old wounds faded into something deeper, something quieter. For those who have endured the long winters of the spirit, understanding arrives not in thunder, but in accumulation. The truest miracles never announce themselves with lightning. They emerge in the faithful tending of a garden, the slow knitting of a heart that was once torn open. We spend so many early years in motion, running toward futures we cannot see, fleeing pasts we cannot change, only to learn that real strength lives in the willingness to stay, to endure, to be the one who keeps the fire burning when the storm howls outside. There is a particular beauty in a life that has been broken and then rebuilt. Like cracked pottery mended with gold, the fractures do not weaken the vessel. They become the very lines that give it worth. For Arthur and Mina, and for anyone who has stood before a shut gate holding nothing but a handful of tired hopes, the lasting truth is plain. Home is not found, it is made. Built through the ordinary, daily practice of showing up. It lived in the coffee poured before dawn for another's hands. The gate reinforced so a child could wander safely, the grip tightened in darkness when memory pressed too close. Love, we learn, is no young man's sentiment. It is the decision to carry a share of someone else's weight, and in doing so, lighten a burden they were never meant to bear alone. The world stays indifferent to our suffering. This much becomes clear with age. But we were never meant to face that indifference without someone standing beside us. The creek runs whether we grieve or rejoice, but a companion on its bank makes the water's voice something gentler. Every small act of kindness becomes a rebellion against the world's cruelty. to trust again after betrayal, to offer care after abandonment. That is the true measure, the quiet steel that defines a life worth having lived. In hindsight, the moments we mistook for endings were only the first words of a different, deeper story. The Chronicle of Iron Creek, in the end, belongs to all of us. It reminds us that no matter how late the hour, how long the road, it is never too late to plant a new garden, never too late to hold the gate open for another, and life, for all its cruelty, all its blind indifference, still leaves a road back toward the light. If a man is willing to bleed for it, if he can endure the dark long enough, the family we build with our own hands holds stronger than the one we inherited. Blood is accident. Choosing to stay, that is iron. That is bone deep. And somewhere inside that stubborn, deliberate loyalty, a stillness settles. Not happiness exactly. Something harder, something earned. The quiet knowing that the wandering is done, that this ground beneath your boots is finally, truly, home.